Hola, konnichiwa, ciao, and greetings. This is Professor Tatum here to lead you through yet another lecture for History 1301. Here we'll be looking at the end of the era of good feelings and the presidency of Andrew Jackson. A little bit of context as usual. Then we're looking at the election of 1824, see how that marked the end of the era of good feelings. And then we're going to examine Jackson's claim to be the people's president. Look at a few different incidents of his presidency and say, where does this fit or not fit with him being the people's president? So the era of good feelings, remember, had been this period where there was one political party that started basically after the War of 1812 with the Hartford Convention. Remember, the Hartford Convention was where the Federalists basically had all kinds of protests against the War of 1812 and against the Democratic Republican administration that had led the nation through the War of 1812. And they brought their resolutions to the public right around the time that news was spreading about Andrew Jackson's victory in New Orleans, and people were thinking that they had won the War of 1812. So they looked very unpatriotic, and that lost the Federalists all kinds of support. And from there, their party ended up eventually collapsing. And then there's one political party really with any clout from there, getting this the name of the era of good feelings. We also saw that during the era of good feelings, there had been more suffrage available to more individuals, right? More white men were able to vote because a lot of states had begun dropping property ownership as a requirement for people to vote. So even people who didn't own property, white men that is, now had the right to vote. Despite that, there was very low voter turnout throughout this period for reasons we had discussed. Remember, there was only one political party, so you generally knew what was going to happen more or less. There's no secret ballot, so that could cause problems if everybody knows who you're voting for. Furthermore, you generally knew what to expect from your candidate because all candidates except one so far had been an elite white guy from Virginia. The only major difference in the other guy is that he was not from Virginia. All right. So you knew pretty much who's coming into office. That was all about to change, though. With the election of 1824, we got an interesting cast of characters all running for president. First of all, there's nobody from Virginia. All right. There's no traditional Virginian planter. There's people from all different states, and among them is this guy that nobody really expected to run for presidency. And that's the military commander we've looked at before, Andrew Jackson, who we already saw during the War of 1812, massacred the Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend during the Creek Wars, and also led the victory at the Battle of New Orleans, where he killed or captured about 2,000 British soldiers when the war was already over. We also saw him pursuing the Seminoles across international borders. So this guy's kind of a hothead, but he's also more of a people's person than the other candidates here. Okay, he doesn't try to act like an elite. He gained his wealth later in his life, but he grew up poor, and he kind of clung to the kind of poor traditions that he grew up with. All right, he would eat with his hands, and he would drink, and he would curse, and he didn't care who thought what about it. In many ways, had characteristics that more Americans could relate to than any politician they'd seen so far. And definitely more than these clowns here. He's a clown too. I'm not picking on anybody. They're all clowns. But this got a lot of people more interested in this election, and there was a much higher voter turnout in this election of 1824 than there had been throughout the era of good feelings. Andrew Jackson really appealed to a lot of people with his common man kind of ethos he had going on. And so he had won the popular vote, but the popular vote, of course, is not what determines who becomes president. It's the electoral vote. When it came to the electoral vote, Jackson clearly had the highest number of votes, but he did not have the majority he needed to become president. And nobody got the majority. They needed to have over 50% to become president, and nobody got that much. And as we've seen before, for the US Constitution, when there is some kind of dispute with the presidential election, the procedure is for the House of Representatives to have a special election, okay, and to decide who's going to be the president. So the House of Representatives met, and they had an election, and they determined that John Quincy Adams, the son of the John Adams we looked at before, was going to be president, all right? So he had less votes than Jackson, came kind of in second place, but they voted him to be president. And Jackson was pretty annoyed about this, and he started suggesting that this was all the result of a corrupt bargain. He suggested that Henry Clay, who had also been a candidate, worked with John Quincy Adams, and they kind of worked together to convince all the members of the House of Representatives to vote for John Quincy Adams instead of Jackson. All right. He said this is a corrupt bargain. They're doing each other favors. The only evidence he really had for this is that Henry Clay was appointed as John Quincy Adams' Secretary of State. Okay. His argument was, well, he appointed him that only because he had helped him get into office as part of this corrupt bargain. That doesn't necessarily add up to that. And there's really no other evidence whatsoever to suggest that there was any kind of corrupt bargain. But Jackson took this idea that he had been cheated by a corrupt bargain and he ran with it. We do also need to understand kind of the significance of Henry Clay becoming Secretary of State. Secretary of State was seen as the stepping stone to the presidency. A lot of U.S. presidents up to this point had been Secretary of State in earlier administrations before they became president. So Jackson's really upset that he's giving Clay this opportunity here. But he's going on with this idea that he's been screwed by a corrupt bargain, and he used this as his basis to break away from the Democratic Republican Party and found his own political party, known as the Democratic Party, along with another bozo named Martin Van Buren. And they created this party that's supposed to be based on fighting the kind of corruption that allegedly kept Jackson out of the presidency in the first place. All right, and he's saying, if you elect me, I will be the people's president. All right, I will work on your behalf. Yes, this is, by the way, the Democratic Party that we know in the present day, but I strongly advise against trying to draw direct lines and trying to understand one to understand the other, because it operates much differently in the present than it did at this point, and had much different ideology and politics at play. So don't try drawing direct lines, but this is the birth of the modern Democratic Party. But he's really running really hard in this next election to be the people's president, and running on this anti-corruption campaign, trying to appeal to all the common people as much as possible, saying, you have been cheated for too long by these wealthy elites. I'm going to help put more power in your hands. I'm going to cut down the power of the federal government, give more power to the states, and in turn give more power directly to you. And this was all very swaying, and it got a lot of more people coming out and voting than before. And Jackson ended up winning this election. Okay, he received a good deal of support, both in the popular vote, and he received this time enough electoral votes as well to become president. So now he has a pretty big reputation to live up to, right? He's promised to be the people's president. So let's take a look now at some of the key components that he had to grapple with throughout his presidency and see how they fit or do not fit with his claim to be the people's president. So one thing that was very prevalent in Jackson's presidency is what's called the spoils system. The spoils system refers to when a politician grants jobs, basically government positions or favors, to their supporters or their friends or family members. Okay, so they're granting jobs and favors to friends, family members, and supporters, regardless of whether or not those people are qualified for those positions. So they're using their support rather than their merit to make that decision to give them these appointments. All right. And we see a clear example of just how out of hand this was in Jackson's presidency if we take a look at his inauguration party that got really out of hand. There's all these people storming to the Capitol, basically trashing the Capitol, having this giant party. And they're there on one hand to celebrate, okay, we got the people's president in office, we can enjoy being common people as part of the government. But the majority of these people were kind of waiting on line to meet with Jackson because they knew he was going to appoint them some kind of job or some kind of favor in exchange for their political support, showing us just how extreme the spoil system was during his presidency. So how does this fit within his claim to be the people's president, all right? There's clearly some elements of corruption there. He's doing favors for certain people just because they're doing favors for him rather than considering their merit, okay? So on one hand, we can see he's giving common people some opportunities maybe they wouldn't have had before, right? Maybe he's giving more common people access to positions in government that are going to get them a little more pay. He's doing favors for common people. But we've also got to consider the potential downside there. As I suggested, a lot of these people aren't necessarily qualified for the positions that they're doing. And these are government positions, okay? These are positions that people depend on them for. And by having incompetent people in some of these positions, that can really cause some trouble for a lot of other common people, right? So a little this, little that. And he also does seem to be bending here his claims to be fighting corruption because he's doing something pretty corrupt here by putting his supporters and friends and family in office without considering their merit or their qualifications. Another key point of Jackson's presidency where we need to consider this claim of the people's president is with the bank war, okay? The bank war was a war he fought on the second bank of the United States. The second bank had been chartered in the same way that the first bank had. Remember with the first bank, we saw that they opened it for a certain amount of time. And they said, after that amount of time, we'll take a look at it, kind of see where we're at, decide if we want to keep it around or shut it down. This second bank was the exact same way. Okay, it had a 20-year charter. And after the 20 years, the federal government was going to reevaluate whether or not they wanted to keep this bank. And Jackson hated this bank for multiple reasons. Okay, one reason is he hated the concept of soft money. Or bank notes, meaning any kind of paper that's demonstrating, hey, this is worth a certain amount of money. He wanted to see physical hard money that actually has an intrinsic value. He wanted to use coins that were actually valuable within themselves. Ironic considering his face is now on soft money, right? He's on the face of the $20 bill. But he also didn't like the fact that this second bank was giving loans primarily to traditional old money elites, okay? He suggested that this bank was corrupt because it was only supporting long-standing wealthy individuals. It was not giving loans to common people. And hell, it wasn't even giving loans in a lot of cases to people who had recently gained some money. So people like him, kind of newer money. They were really only keeping money in the hands of the same individuals, giving them loans. And because they were doing all this, he claimed that this bank was unconstitutional. But it's not really in his place to say whether anything is constitutional or not. That's not the job of the president. The executive's job is to execute the law. It's the job of the Supreme Court to interpret the law and determine whether something is constitutional. And we saw that in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, the Supreme Court had already determined that this bank was, in fact, constitutional. But Jackson's sitting there saying, no, I don't agree, so it's not constitutional. And because he's declaring it unconstitutional for all these reasons he didn't like, he refused to approve the recharter of the bank. He's decided he's not going to keep this bank around. He's going to let it fail. But that wasn't enough for Jackson to just let it fall on its own. He wanted to wage a war on this bank. He wanted to see it suffer and to collapse as quickly as possible. So he started pulling all of the money he could out of that federal bank and putting it instead into what he called pet banks. So pet banks were smaller state or regional level banks that supported Andrew Jackson. And these pet banks were giving out loans left and right, okay? They were giving loans to common people because they're Jackson supporters and that's what he told them to do. Well, okay, that works for the short term, but there's kind of reasons that banks are hesitant about how much they loan to who, okay? I'm not saying banks don't screw people over on the daily, they certainly do, but there are reasons that banks are hesitant to loan out certain amounts of money to certain individuals. They tend to loan money out to people who have a long track record of paying back their loans. And that kind of came to play here. A lot of the people receiving these loans from pet banks were unable to pay back their loans, and that led a lot of banks to collapse. And this led to some serious economic hardships, okay? This led to the Panic of 1837, which really screwed the U.S. economically. Something we do need to note is around the time that Jackson was fighting this bank war, some of his critics started forming their own political party to oppose his Democratic Party. They call that party the Whig Party. And I just cannot discuss the Whig Party and live with myself without bringing this up. They were experts at using political cartoons to criticize Andrew Jackson. And they have this popular political cartoon here called King Andrew, where they have this picture of Andrew Jackson as this tyrannical monarch stepping all over the U.S. Constitution. And he has his veto in hand, ready to stop Congress from doing whatever he doesn't want them to do. All right, let's consider, though, how does this bank war fit within Jackson's claim to be the people's president? On one hand, by opening these pet banks and putting all the funds into the pet banks, he is giving more loans to more common people. So in the short term, they're getting more money. That's certainly helpful. But in the long term, when they're unable to pay back those loans, that led to the Panic of 1837, which had all kinds of economic ramifications on common people. So we got to weigh that one out there. Another thing we need to consider during Jackson's presidency was what was referred to as the nullification crisis. This was all based around a tariff called the Tariff of Abominations. That's what people referred to it as because they thought it was so horrible. Remember, a tariff is a tax on an imported good, so a tax on a good coming from somewhere else. And what happened under this Tariff of Abomination is it was taxing European countries so much for the goods that were coming in that they started imposing counter tariffs, okay? So they started placing tariffs on U.S. goods. And these counter tariffs were very crippling to the South, especially to states like South Carolina, okay, because they're shipping off a lot of cotton over to Europe, and now they're having to pay high tariffs to ship that cotton. So they want this tariff of abominations shut down so that they'll stop having to pay this counter tariff over here when they're shipping cotton off to Europe. And they're hoping that along will come the people's president to shut down this tariff of abomination. And Jackson really hated this tariff also, but for political reasons. So he gonna just let the tariff be. He said, I know, guys, I don't like it either, but suck it up. And when he told the South to suck it up and keep paying the tariff, one of his critics in South Carolina, who he'd had a falling out with much earlier, a guy named John C. Calhoun, took South Carolina to lead this kind of refusal to comply with the tariff. John C. Calhoun and his supporters in South Carolina wrote a doctrine of nullification, in which they said that they were going to consider this tariff null and void, based on a much bigger argument that states could nullify federal laws if they found them unconstitutional, like they did with this tariff here. Now, we've kind of heard this argument before, haven't we? This is basically mirroring the argument made under the Kentucky and Virginia Resolution, saying that because states gave the federal government its power when they ratified the Constitution, they can choose which laws they want to comply with and which ones they don't. But we've already kind of talked through that. We know that's not quite accurate, but that's the argument they're making here. So they're trying to refuse to pay this tariff. Jackson, we got to understand, he didn't like the tariff either, but what he didn't like more than anything is being told no. Okay, he's a hard-ass military commander, and he cannot stand when somebody does not follow his orders. So he had told the states to comply with this tariff. Now they're saying, no, we're going to nullify it. We're not going to comply. And so he got really upset, and he pressured Congress to help him pass what was known as the Force Bill. So the Force Bill was this bill he created that would grant him military authority to take the troops down into South Carolina and force them to comply with national law. But he also said, look, guys down in the South, I can very well bring the army down here and force you to pay this, but I'd rather work things out reasonably. So I'll also make a compromise tariff that will gradually reduce the rates you're paying under the tariff of abomination. Okay, so we got to pay something. I can work it out to where you can pay a little less. And if you don't comply, well, I'm coming down with the army. So South Carolina eventually said, well, if our choices are to pay no matter what, maybe we get to pay a little bit less, or to have Jackson come down with his troops. And we know the way Jackson acts when he's leading troops. We've seen it in the Seminole War and the War of 1812. Hell no, they made the smart choice and backed down. They gave up this idea of nullification. Again, we need to consider, where does this fit within his claim to be the people's president? Well, on one hand, he's threatening to use military force to go into the streets of common people. This is also contradictory to a lot of his claims in terms of where he stands politically and limiting the power of the federal government to empower the states so that they can act more on behalf of the people. He's now kind of overriding what the state governments are saying with the federal government. Yet he's also perhaps protecting from a larger disunion that could come out of this. States start left and right deciding what laws they are and are not going to follow. That could lead to some serious disunion throughout the nation, which could lead to major problems for common people. So again, there's something to weigh there. How much does this fit within the claims of the common people? That's for you to decide. Final aspect of Jackson's presidency where we need to evaluate this is with Native American removal. Okay. And the word removal, I want to spend a second here kind of making clear that just like with the word expansion, we need to be careful of the way we perceive this, because it can come across as a way that this is just some kind of inevitable process that just happened. We need to be very clear that this is a result of human thoughts, actions, and decisions that impacted human beings, okay? And in this case, there's going to be sovereign nations dispossessed of their homelands by another sovereign nation, individuals within another sovereign nation, because they're making the choice to do so, all right? And we need to be very clear on that. So really understand this, we need to understand Jackson's views on indigenous peoples. He considered them to be somehow inferior, okay? He considered them to be racially inferior, but he also considered Native American culture to be inherently inferior to U.S. culture, okay? And his justification for Indian removal was that he suggested that U.S. expansion was kind of inevitable, that white Americans would continue to expand, and that as they did so, they would continue to overpower Native Americans. All right, so he's using this paternalistic type of lens here to suggest that all he really wants to do is protect indigenous peoples from the harm that they will inevitably face as Americans move out west and start fighting with them to get claims on their land. So he's saying, why don't you just move peacefully the way I want you to, and you won't get killed. That's his justification, at least. Maybe he believes it to an extent, but that's the basis of his Indian removal policy. The way he's going to protect indigenous peoples is by passing the Indian Removal Act. So the Indian Removal Act allowed the federal government to make treaties with different indigenous nations and to force them to move off of their homelands and to go to what was called Indian Territory, which is basically an area set aside for indigenous peoples in Oklahoma, where they'd all be clumped together and made dependent on the U.S. government in different ways. We've already seen there's a long history of Indian removal in the U.S. by this point, right? We saw George Washington, for example, during his administration. There was the Treaty of Grenville, in which the Northwest Confederacy was kind of pressured off of their lands. This is just making this a very official federal policy, saying this is the way we're going to handle indigenous peoples moving forward. And these treaties, just like the Treaty of Grenville, were usually very questionable in their nature. And it was a lot of coercing certain individuals within indigenous nations to believe that it's in their best interest to go along with these removal policies, and they'd get them to sign, and then they'd hold the whole nation responsible. Remember, I suggested before, that's kind of like if I get one or two of you in here to agree to something I want you to do, and then I make the whole class go along with it and say, oh yeah, y'all all agreed to this. So they'll get people who really don't have a lot of authority in their nation at some points to agree to this and then hold them accountable regardless. And as you might imagine, not everybody just went along with this. There was a good deal of resistance to Indian removal. One clear example we can see there is through Black Hawk's War. So in Black Hawk's War, representatives from various indigenous nations, including the Sauk, Fox, and Kickapoos, under the leadership of a chief named Black Hawk, returned to the land that they had been kicked out of, okay? They were going to just kind of try to show back up and resettle on their land, maybe make some agreements with the people there. But when the U.S. settlers saw this large group of indigenous peoples coming, they assumed, oh shit, they're here to kill us. So they started being proactive and fired on them. And then Black Hawk did turn this into a war at that point, okay? From there, he made it clear that he meant business and he fought back. Black Hawk and his forces were eventually defeated. Main point I want us to see here, though, this is a clear example of indigenous people just resisting Indian removal. Okay, I want to be clear that there was resistance. Another clear example of that we can see is with the Seminoles, who lived in the Southeast, in places like Florida. So the federal government was trying to remove the Seminoles from Florida and make them go to Indian Territory in Oklahoma, and several of them resisted. Remember the Seminoles we've seen before were living in Florida when Florida had been Spanish territory, and there's a lot of enslaved people escaping to Spanish Florida to escape slavery. Well, a lot of those Black people who were living with the Seminole now knew that if they went along with this agreement for removal, that once they got back to other parts of the U.S., they would probably be re-enslaved, okay? So they fought very hard to try to defend their claims here over the Seminoles' lands in Florida as well. In this war with the Seminoles, the Second Seminole War, as it became known, was no joke, okay? The U.S. government ended up losing somewhere around 15,000 people, but ended up spending nearly 3 times the money that they had spent to buy the entire Louisiana territory to fight this war, showing just how strong of a resistance the Seminoles and their enslaved allies were putting up. Another clear example that everybody wasn't just going along with these policies of removal, and there was a good bit of resistance to this expansion. Another major case we can see of resistance is with the case of Worcester versus Georgia. Yes, that is pronounced Worcester. I know it looks like Washer Sister sauce. What's the other one I've heard of? Worcester sauce. That sauce that nobody knows how to say the name of. I've heard everything. By the time I heard Washer Sister sauce, I just gave up on trying to say it right. But this here is actually pronounced Worcester. Okay, Worcester versus Georgia was this case in which the state of Georgia was wanting to remove the Cherokees out of Georgia because they had discovered gold on Cherokee land. And they wanted to get a hold of that gold. So the state of Georgia made a treaty with some of the Cherokees there in the land, kind of typical illegitimate treaty where the people who signed it didn't really have the authority to speak for all the Cherokees. But because there was a treaty, the state of Georgia is trying to say, you guys all had to get out of Georgia. Let us have your gold. And these Cherokees, majority of whom had not agreed to this treaty, decided to use the U.S. legal system to resist this. Okay, they took this to the Supreme Court and they argued, we are a sovereign nation. And as a sovereign nation, you cannot just come and kick us out of our homeland. And the Supreme Court actually agreed with the Cherokees here, okay? They ruled in favor of Cherokee sovereignty. They said this is a sovereign nation. And their big argument was, the Supreme Court's big argument in this case was, that only the federal government can make treaties with sovereign nations. Therefore, Georgia had no right to push this sovereign nation out of their homeland. This is a clear example, again, of people resisting Indian removal. But when Jackson heard about the rulings of Worcester versus Georgia, he said, okay, cool. That's what the Supreme Court has to say. Let them enforce it. Again, as we know, if we look at separation of powers, which Jackson we see kind of bring into question twice now, the Supreme Court's job is not to enforce anything. That's the executive's job. Their job is simply to interpret the law. But he's saying, okay, they made their decision, let them enforce it. Basically saying he was going to do nothing to try to stop people in Georgia from kicking the Cherokees out of their land if they wanted to. Even further than that, Jackson decided he was going to try to push for a national treaty with the Cherokees to try to encourage them to move out of their homeland. So he very clearly just undermined the Supreme Court ruling and is going to do whatever he can to encourage Cherokee removal from Georgia. So there was a faction within the Cherokees under a guy named John Ridge who were part of what was called the Treaty Party, all right? Because they were interested in making a treaty with the federal government, the U.S. government under Jackson, because they had been coerced into believing that removal was their best option, okay? And they ended up creating with the U.S. government behind the back of the majority of Cherokees what was called the Treaty of New Dakota. All right, so the Treaty of New Dakota is this treaty in which the Cherokees, well, a few of the Cherokees, that is, agreed that their entire nation would move out of the state of Georgia. All right, and again, they did this without consulting the majority of the nation or the people who really had the authority to make this decision. But because there was a treaty made, that's all the justification that Jackson needed to come in and use the army to force the Cherokees out of Georgia, and led to what was known as the Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee Nation was forcefully marched out of Georgia to Indian Territory. And this was a very horrific exodus that they were placed on here, okay? They faced extreme weather conditions, they faced starvation, and about a quarter of the Cherokee Nation traveling here to Indian Territory died before they even arrived as a result of this Trail of Tears. And that's not to account for all those who would be killed when they got there by rival indigenous peoples who were also being settled in Indian Territory, or by starvation, as they're now being kind of placed as subjects to the U.S. government. When they get to Indian Territory, they're in this unfamiliar land, right, where they don't know how to farm, they don't know where to hunt, they're surrounded by enemies, so they became very dependent on the U.S. government for things like rations and food to survive. All right, again here, we need to consider, how does Indian removal fit within the claim that Jackson is the people's president? Well, I guess considering what people were talking about, some people benefited from this. There's some people who got to move into the Cherokees' former lands, and they had some really nice homes and farms that people moved into. Also, the U.S. government is now getting a hold of all that gold. That can help stimulate the U.S. economy. But what about the indigenous people who suffered as a result of this, whose sovereignty was ignored, and a quarter of an entire nation being killed here? This, by the way, with the Cherokees is just one example of several indigenous nations who face similar fates, okay? Got to take that all into question there. Well, guys, I'd love to stay and lecture all day, but I'm afraid it's time I've gone away. Got places to go and places to be, things to know and things to see. I'll be back again someday, but my friends, till then I say farewell. Let me know if you got any questions. Otherwise, this is it for now. Over and out.